The Wagon manifest listed her between a crate of iron nails and 2 barrels of salted pork, and when Martin Sullivan read that paper by the light of a dying campfire, something in his chest cracked clean open like dry timber. The year was 1873, and the Kansas plains stretched out in every direction like God had ironed the earth flat and forgotten to put anything interesting on it. Martin Sullivan had ridden these plains for 11 years, first as a cattle hand, then as a scout for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, and lately as a man who took whatever work paid enough to keep his horse fed and his boots resoled. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with hands that had known rope and reins and cold creek water but very little tenderness. He had seen a great many things on the frontier that had scraped his faith in people down to almost nothing. But he had never, in all his years of riding through towns that smelled of horse dung and ambition, seen a human name written in a freight column of a Wagon manifest. He had come across the manifest by accident. He had been hired 3 days prior in the town of Ellsworth by a freight company owner named Cyrus Brandt to escort a 4-wagon supply train west toward the newly established settlement of Grover's Crossing. The pay was decent, the job was straightforward, and Martin had asked no questions beyond which direction they were headed. He had been given a packet of paperwork to keep track of, the kind of clerical nonsense he normally handed to whoever was literate enough to read it faster than him. But the evening of the 3rd day, camped along a shallow creek bed where the cottonwood trees leaned over the water like tired old men, he had opened the packet because he was restless and could not sleep. He read through the first 2 pages without much interest. Flour, dry goods, rope, axle grease, ammunition, bolts of cotton fabric. And then his eyes landed on it, midway down the 3rd page, written in the same flat businesslike hand as everything else above and below it. One female, Della Keating, age 23. Brown hair, brown eyes, delivered per arrangement to Harlan Greer of Grover's Crossing. Cargo, domestic and labor services, indefinite term. Martin read the line 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time because he thought he must have misread it. He had not misread it. The word cargo was right there, plain as stone. He sat very still for a long moment, listening to the fire pop and the horses shift their weight in the dark. His jaw had gone tight. Something moved in the back of his throat that was not quite a word and not quite a sound. He stood up slowly, walked 2 paces to the edge of the firelight, and then he looked down at the page in his hand. He thought about Harlan Greer. He had heard the name once before, in passing, from a blacksmith in Wichita who had said only that Greer was the kind of man who always got what he wanted, and who had never in his life been told no by anyone who stayed standing afterward. Martin Sullivan folded the manifest page slowly, deliberately, until it was a small square. Then he unfolded it. Then he tore it in half, and then into quarters, and then into pieces small enough that the night wind caught them and carried them off toward the creek. He walked to the back of the 4th wagon. He had not paid much attention to the 4th wagon, beyond verifying it was hitched and moving. It was covered with a heavy canvas tarp that was lashed down on all sides. He had assumed it carried the more delicate freight, things that needed protection from the dust and the weather. He untied the rear lashing with steady hands and lifted the canvas. A woman sat in the back of the wagon, her knees drawn up to her chest, her wrists bound with a length of rough rope that had already raised red marks on her skin. She was not gagged, but she was clearly exhausted, leaning against a crate of iron nails with her eyes closed. A single small lantern hung from a hook on the wagon's inner frame, and it cast her face in pale gold light. Brown hair, partly unpinned, falling across one cheek. A jaw set hard even in what looked like near sleep. Hands folded together as though she had long since stopped pulling at the rope. She opened her eyes the moment the canvas moved. They were brown and they were not soft. They were the eyes of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had decided that afraid was no longer a useful thing to be. She looked at him without flinching. "If you are here to tell me we are nearly there," she said, "you can save your breath. I have decided I am not going." Martin blinked. He had not expected that to be the first thing she said. "My name is Martin Sullivan," he said. "I am the outrider on this train. I did not know you were in here." She studied him with those dark, steady eyes. "Then you know now." "Yes," he said, "I do." He climbed up into the wagon and crouched in front of her. "I am going to untie your wrists." She did not thank him immediately. She watched him pull a small jackknife from his boot and work through the rope with careful strokes. When the rope fell away, she brought her wrists to her chest and rubbed them slowly. "Who hired you?" she asked. "Cyrus Brant. And you did not know what was in the fourth wagon?" "No," he said, "I did not." He looked at her directly. "I found a manifest tonight that listed you as cargo." Something moved across her face then, a flash of something so raw and wounded that Martin had to look away for just a second, not from embarrassment but from the force of it. "What did you do with the manifest?" she asked. "I tore it up." She was quiet. Then she said, "That will not stop Harlan Greer." "No," Martin agreed. "It will not. But it was the only honest thing I could think to do with it." Her name was Della Keating, and she told him her story in a low, measured voice while they sat in the back of that wagon with the Kansas night pressing in from all sides and the horses sleeping in their traces. She was 23 years old, born in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of fever 3 years prior, and a mother who had followed him to the grave 2 months later, leaving Della alone with a small house, a large debt, and no family within 500 miles. She had come west the previous year seeking work, which was a common enough story, and had found a position in Ellsworth cooking and keeping house for a family named Prentice. The Prentice family had been good people. The trouble had come from Cyrus Brant, who owned a great deal of Ellsworth and who had apparently struck a business arrangement with Harlan Greer of Grover's Crossing, an arrangement that Della had not been informed of until 2 men from Brant's freight office had appeared at the Prentice house 3 days ago, while the family was at Sunday service, told Della she was needed at the office for a question about wages, and then locked her in the back of a wagon before she had time to understand what was happening. "They told me Brant had agreed to send Greer a domestic servant," Della said. "They told me Greer had paid for it. They told me I had been selected." She paused. "They did not ask me." "Nobody asked you," Martin said. "It was not a question." "Nobody asked me," she confirmed. Martin sat with that for a moment. The cruelty of it was not complicated. It was very simple and very old, the belief that a woman alone, without family or money or standing, could be moved from one place to another like furniture. He had known this cruelty existed. He had seen the edges of it before. But having it right here in front of him, having it be a real woman with rub-draw wrists and a voice that was still steady despite everything, made it feel like something different entirely. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. "If I had anywhere to go," she said quietly, "I would have gone there before any of this happened." He nodded slowly. "All right then." He looked down at his hands for a moment. "Here is what I am thinking, Miss Keating. This train is going to reach Grover's Crossing in 3 days if nothing slows us. Brant's men, the driver and the outrider on Wagon 1, both know you are in this wagon. They are going to notice before morning that you are loose." "I know that," she said. "So we have tonight." He looked at her. "My horse is staked about 50 yards north of camp. I have a bedroll, a rifle, enough dried beef and hardtack for a week, and enough money in my saddlebag to get us as far as Dodge City, maybe as far as Pueblo. I know people in both places." She looked at him very carefully. "You are offering to ride out of here with me." "I am." "You would lose your pay. Brant would blacklist you with every freight company in Kansas." "Probably," Martin said. "But I do not think I will be able to sleep very soundly knowing I handed you over to Harlan Greer." Della Keating looked at this man who had untied her wrists and torn up a paper, and was now sitting in the back of a wagon in the dark offering to throw away his livelihood. She had known very few men who had done anything for her without expecting something in return. She kept her face still and her voice level because she had learned that showing how much something meant to her was the fastest way to have it taken away. "Where would we go?" she asked. "There is a town called Beaumont, about 60 miles southwest of here, just off the Cimarron branch. It is small, but it has a proper sheriff and a women's boarding house run by a lady named Rosalind Hatch who does not ask a great many questions. You would be safe there while we figured out the next step." "And what is the next step?" Martin thought about it honestly. "I do not know yet," he admitted. "Would be a next step, which is more than you have got right now." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the wagon, a coyote called somewhere to the west, and the sound faded into the dark like a question that no one answered. "All right, Mr. Sullivan," Della said. "Let us go." They moved quietly and quickly. Della climbed down from the wagon first, and Martin steadied her by the elbow without thinking about it, just as a person would do for another person stepping down from a height in the dark. She did not pull away, but she did not lean into it either. They crossed the camp on careful feet, giving the sleeping forms of Brant's two men a wide berth. Martin reached his horse, a big steady roan named Dutch that had the sense not to make noise when noise would cause problems, and saddled him by feel and memory. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, checked it, replaced it. He checked his saddlebag. Everything he had said was there. He looked at Della. She was standing straight in the darkness with her arms crossed over her chest, not from cold, but from something that looked like the physical effort of holding herself together. "You will have to ride with me," he said. "There is no second horse." "I know how to ride," she said. I did not doubt it. He mounted first and then reached down, and she took his hand and put her foot in the stirrup and swung up behind him with the ease of someone who had done it before. She settled in behind the saddle, her hands resting lightly on his sides. Dutch moved out at a walk until they were far enough from camp that Martin could bring him up to a trot. He pointed them southwest and rode. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 18 miles. Martin knew this stretch of country, and he knew a small line of bluffs where a person could rest in the shade without being visible from the flats. He brought Dutch up into the rocks, and they dismounted and let the horse drink from a shallow seep of water that trickled down through the limestone. Della sat on a flat rock, and Martin handed her the canteen and a strip of dried beef and a square of hardtack. She ate without ceremony. He liked that about her immediately, the way she simply did what needed to be done without making a performance of it. "How far are we from Beaumont?" she asked. "At a good pace, 2 days," he said. "We cannot push Dutch too hard carrying double." She nodded. She looked out across the plains below the bluffs, golden and enormous in the early light. "Will Brant send someone after us?" "Brant will certainly send word ahead to Greer," Martin said. "Whether Greer sends men back, that depends on how badly he wants to collect on what he paid Brant." "Enough that Brant took me in the first place," Della said. "Right." Martin considered the problem with the same methodical calm he applied to route planning and weather reading. "We will avoid the main trail. It will add time, but it will keep us out of view." She turned her head and looked at him. "You are very calm about all of this." "One of us ought to be," he said. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it, the way a prairie flower looks just before it opens. "Is that your usual manner, calm?" "Pretty much," he said. "Tends to annoy people." "I do not find it annoying," she said. They rested through the hottest part of the day, taking turns watching the approaches from the bluffs, and moved again in the late afternoon when the lights softened and the heat let up enough for Dutch to work without distress. Martin rode and Della rode behind him, and gradually, across the long, quiet miles, the stiffness between them began to ease the way ice eases in a slow river, without drama, just a gradual softening. She asked him about himself, and he answered honestly. He had grown up in Missouri, fourth son of a farmer who had worked himself to the bone on 40 acres of rocky soil, and died owing more than he owned. Martin had left at 16 with a horse that wasn't quite his and a pocket that wasn't quite full, and had ridden west because west was where a man with nothing much could still find something to do. He had worked cattle drives up the Kisham Trail 3 times, had spent a year with a survey crew mapping the Arkansas River Basin, had scouted for the railway. He had never settled anywhere because he had never found anywhere that felt worth settling. "What does somewhere worth settling feel like?" Della asked. Her voice came from just behind his shoulder, and it was close enough that he could hear it clearly above the sound of Dutch's hooves. He thought about it. "I suppose it would feel like somewhere I wanted to be in the morning," he said, "not just somewhere I ended up." She was quiet for a moment. "I have not had that either," she said. "Not since my parents were alive." They did not speak for a while after that, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had recognized something in each other, and were taking a quiet moment to consider what to do with that recognition. The second day brought a complication. They came around a bend in the dry creek bed they had been following and found themselves 20 yards from a group of 4 riders who were stopped in the shade of a cottonwood grove, watering their horses. Martin pulled Dutch up immediately. 2 of the riders were strangers, but 2 were not. One of them was a man named Cole Dunbar, who rode for Cyrus Brant, and who had once tried to buy Martin a drink in a saloon in Ellsworth in the manner of a man who wants a favor. Cole Dunbar saw Martin at exactly the same moment Martin saw him. There was a half-second of absolute stillness, the kind that comes right before weather breaks. Martin turned Dutch and put his heels to the horse, and they went up out of the creek bed at a canter and across the open flat toward a line of low hills to the west. Behind them he heard shouting and then hoofbeats. He did not look back. "Hold on," he said to Della, and she pressed in behind him and gripped his coat, and he pushed Dutch into a full run. Dutch was a large horse, but he was honest, and he had more heart than most, and he ran with everything he had. Martin kept them moving in a straight line for a quarter-mile, and then cut hard north toward a rocky area he could see rising from the plain, a tumble of limestone shelves and cedar breaks that would be hard country for horses that did not know it. Dutch knew it because Martin knew it, and had ridden this quarter of Kansas enough times to have it mapped in the back of his mind. They went into the rocks at a controlled pace now, weaving between the cedars, and Martin chose his path deliberately, turning twice on bare stone where hoofprints would not register. After a quarter-hour of careful work, he brought Dutch to a halt in a deep notch between 2 limestone shelves, completely hidden from the flat below. He could hear the other horses somewhere to the south, moving, quartering, but not coming closer. After another 10 minutes the sounds faded. Della had not made a sound through any of it. Her grip on his coat had been firm but not panicked. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, after a pause, "That was Cole Dunbar. You know him." "He is the man who put me in the wagon," she said. Her voice was even, but there was something beneath it, the controlled sound of old anger being kept in its proper place. Martin felt something cold move through him that was not fear. It was the particular coldness of a person who has looked at an injustice from close range and found it completely, clearly unacceptable. "He will not put you anywhere again," Martin said. She did not respond to that immediately. Then she said, "How can you promise that?" "Because I am not going to let it happen," he said. "And because we are going to make sure Brant and Greer cannot do this again, not to you and not to anyone else." "How do you intend to do that from out here in the rocks?" "I am working on it," he admitted. She made a small sound that was most definitely a laugh, brief and quiet, and caught almost before it escaped. But it was there, and Martin Sullivan felt it like the first warm day after a long winter. They waited another hour in the rocks to be certain Dunbar's group had moved on. When Martin was satisfied that the flat below was clear, he brought Dutch out of the notch and they resumed their path toward Beaumont. They made camp that night in a hollow where a dry wash curved, building a small fire sheltered by a cutbank. Martin had managed to supplement their food supply at midday by shooting a young prairie hen that had made the mistake of presenting itself, and he roasted it over the fire on a green stick. The smell of it cooking was excellent and ordinary and good, the kind of smell that belongs to a moment of peace. Della sat across the fire from him, and she had managed to repin her hair into a tidier arrangement using what pins she still had. She had also, in a moment of practical resourcefulness, torn a strip from the hem of her petticoat and wrapped it around her right wrist, where the rope had left the worst of the redness. Martin watched her do it from across the fire and did not comment on the resourcefulness because she did not seem to be the type of woman who wanted to be told she was resourceful. She just was. "Tell me about Beaumont," she said. "You mentioned a boarding house." "Rosalind Hatch's place," Martin said. "It is a proper establishment, not a saloon. She has 6 rooms and she lets them to women primarily, school teachers, seamstresses, women passing through. She has a rule about it. She once turned away the territorial governor because he tried to rent a room and she decided she did not like the look of him." Della smiled at that, a full smile this time, and it changed her face considerably. It made her look younger and warmer and like someone who was accustomed to finding things funny even in difficult circumstances. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Della said. "She is a force of nature in a calico dress," Martin confirmed. "She will like you. You cannot know that." "I can make a reasonable guess," he said. "She has very little patience for meekness and you are not meek. She also has very little patience for pretension and you are not that either." Della looked at him across the fire. "You have formed a fairly detailed opinion of me in 2 days." "I pay attention," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment with those dark, steady eyes. "So do I," she said. "I have been paying attention to you, Mr. Sullivan. You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She considered the question seriously. "When you lifted that canvas the first night, I expected one of 2 things. Either someone who would put me back in that wagon or someone who would offer to help me in exchange for something I was not willing to give." She paused. "You were neither." "No," Martin agreed. "You just helped," she said, "without conditions." "That seemed like the correct thing to do," he said. She was quiet, looking at the fire. "It should be the ordinary thing," she said softly. "It should not feel remarkable, but it does." "I know," Martin said, and he did know. He felt the weight of what she was not saying. All the times when help had come with conditions. All the years of being a woman alone in a world that treated aloneness as a vulnerability to be exploited. He was angry on her behalf in a way that was clean and simple, not complicated by anything except the basic understanding that this was wrong. They slept on opposite sides of the fire, Martin with his back to the cutbank and his rifle close to hand, and Della with her coat pulled over her shoulders. He lay awake for a while listening to the plane breathe its night sounds around them and thinking about what came next, practically and honestly. Getting to Beaumont was the first step. What happened after was less clear. He would need to think about Brant, about how to make sure the man could not simply reach out through Greer and find Della again. He was still thinking about it when he fell asleep. In the morning, Della was already awake and had stirred the coals back to life and set a small pot of creek water to boil for the dried coffee he had in his bag. He sat up and watched her work with the economical movements of someone who knew exactly what they were doing around a camp. "You know how to make coffee over a fire," he said. "I grew up in a house with 3 younger brothers," she said. "My mother was often unwell. I learned to cook whatever was available over whatever was burning." He accepted the cup she handed him and drank it, which was terrible in the way that camp coffee always is, and perfect in every other way. They reached Beaumont in the early afternoon of the 3rd day from Ellsworth. It was not much of a town, a wide dirt street with a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, a saloon that looked reasonably respectable, a livery stable, a 2-room sheriff's office, and Rosalind Hatch's boarding house, which was a whitewashed building that looked more cared for than anything else on the street. Martin rode Dutch down the main street at a walk. Della sat behind him, and he was aware of the looks from the few people on the boardwalks. Not hostile looks, simply the honest curiosity of a small town that did not see a great deal of new traffic. He stopped in front of the boarding house and helped Della down and tied Dutch to the rail. The front door opened before they had reached the steps, and a woman appeared in it who was somewhere between 45 and 60, short and very solid, with gray-streaked dark hair pinned with no-nonsense efficiency, and a face that had been weathered by the Kansas wind into something that was not beautiful but was absolutely worth looking at. "Martin Sullivan," Rosalind Hatch said. You look like you have ridden through several kinds of trouble. One or two, he said. Rosalind, this is Della Keating. She needs a room. Rosalind Hatch looked at Della with the complete and unhurried attention of a woman who makes decisions quickly and sticks to them. Then she looked at Della's wrists, which still showed the marks of the rope. Then she looked at Martin. Get that horse stabled, she said to him. Miss Keating, come inside. Martin did as he was told because with Rosalind you simply did. He took Dutch to the livery and arranged board. And while Dutch was being seen to, he stood in the dim cool of the stable and thought through everything carefully. He was going to need to talk to the sheriff. He was going to need to find out whether Beaumont's sheriff was the kind of man who would listen, or the kind who had already been reached by someone with money and preferred arrangements. The sheriff's name was Ray Cobble, and Martin found him in his office, eating a late lunch from a tin plate. He was a man in his late 50s with a long white mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had spent a great many years distinguishing between who was telling the truth and who was not. Martin sat down across from him and told the story plainly and completely, from the Wagon manifest to the torn page to Cole Dunbar in the creek bed. He left nothing out. When he finished, Sheriff Cobble set his tin plate aside and looked at him for a long moment. You know, Cyrus Brant is not a small man, Cobble said. I know, Martin said, and Harlan Greer has connections in the territorial governor's office. I did not know that specifically, Martin said, but I am not surprised. Cobble looked at the wall for a moment. What I am about to tell you, he said slowly, is that what Brant and Greer arranged is illegal. Transporting a person against their will is kidnapping, regardless of what any business arrangement between the two of them says. The fact that they wrote it on a freight manifest does not make it commerce. It makes it worse. Yes, Martin said. Cobble tapped his fingers on his desk. I am going to write to the federal marshal in Wichita today. His name is Tom Harker, and he is not a man who can be bought. I have ridden with him. He paused. In the meantime, Miss Keating stays in Beaumont and Beaumont looks after her. I can promise you that much. Martin felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the night he read the manifest. He went back to Rosalind's boarding house and knocked on the parlor door. Rosalind appeared. She is cleaned up and rested, and she is eating, Rosalind said without preamble. She has told me what happened. I have seen it before, not exactly this, but the shape of it. Men who decide a woman with no one to stand up for her is available to be arranged. Her jaw tightened. Leave her here tonight, Martin. She needs to be somewhere safe that is not moving. Of course, he said. Is there a room at the Henleys? Tom Henley has 2 spare rooms, she confirmed. Now go, and Martin, she looked at him steadily. What you did matters. I want you to know that. He nodded and walked back out into the afternoon light. He took a room at Henley's, which was a family farmhouse half a mile outside town that took in the occasional traveler. He ate supper with the Henley family, a quiet man and his wife and 2 small boys, and afterward he sat on the porch in the cooling air and looked at the stars and thought about Della Keating. She had not asked him to stay. She had not asked him for anything beyond that first ride away from the wagon. She was not the kind of person who reached for things she was uncertain of. He understood that. It came from years of having things taken rather than given, and from the particular pride of someone who had held themselves together through a great deal without any help. But he wanted to stay. He recognized the feeling with some surprise, because it was not the feeling of obligation, which he would have understood, or the feeling of being needed, which was simpler. It was the feeling of wanting to be somewhere. The feeling he had described to her 2 nights ago on the trail, wanting to be in a place in the morning. He wanted to be in Beaumont in the morning because Della Keating was in Beaumont. He gave that fact the honest attention it deserved, turning it over in the quiet, and then he went to bed. In the days that followed, Beaumont settled into a kind of temporary routine around the situation. Sheriff Cobble sent his letter to the federal marshal. Rosalind put Della to work in the boarding house helping with meals and linens, which Della threw herself into with the energy of someone who felt better doing things than being still. Martin took small jobs around town, helping the blacksmith, riding out with a rancher named Hollies who needed an extra hand for a few days to move cattle between pastures. He saw Della every day. It was not difficult to arrange this in a small town. They fell into the habit of walking together in the evening, after the supper hour when the light went golden and the air cooled, down the main street and out toward the edge of town, where a small creek ran between its banks and the cottonwoods made long shadows. They talked about everything and nothing, about what Ohio had been like and what Missouri had been like, about the particular quality of prairie light in different seasons, about books they had read, and Martin admitted that he read more than most people expected from a man in his occupation, and Della said her father had been a school teacher, and that she had grown up with books the way other children grew up with toys, as the primary furniture of her interior life. He told her about a winter he had spent snowbound in a small cabin in the Colorado Territory, alone for 3 weeks with only 2 novels and a deck of cards with 2 cards missing. And she laughed, the real laugh she had, which was warm and unheld, and which he was beginning to collect like someone collects particularly good stones, turning them over to look at their quality. She told him about a summer she had spent teaching the neighbor children in Ohio while their schoolhouse was being rebuilt, 8 children in the shade of her mother's apple tree with a piece of slate and a box of chalk, and the way the smallest one had cried every morning at first, and then gradually began arriving early and waiting on the porch step. "You like teaching," Martin said. "I love teaching," she said, with a directness that was slightly surprising because she had not said she loved anything before that. "It is the thing I would do if I could do anything." "What is stopping you?" She looked at him. "One needs a position, and a school, and a community that wants one." Martin looked out at the creek, then he looked back at her. "Beaumont does not have a school teacher," he said. She went still. "I know," she said quietly. "Rosalind mentioned it, said the nearest teacher is in a town 12 miles east and she only comes 2 days a week." "I know," Della said again. "I am not suggesting anything," Martin said carefully. "I am just noting it." "I know you are," she said. And she looked at him with those brown eyes, and he felt the thing between them that had been building very gradually, like a river in spring, patient and quiet and inevitable. They did not say anything more about it that evening. But they stood beside the creek a little longer than they needed to before walking back to town, and when they reached the boarding house and he said good night and she said good night, there was a pause between the words and the moment of parting that neither of them filled, and neither of them wanted to. The federal marshal arrived 12 days after Sheriff Cobble's letter. His name was Tom Harker, and he was exactly what Cobble had described. A big square man in his late 40s with a flat, determined face, and the manner of someone who believed firmly in the law and had spent 20 years making it work in places that were not particularly hospitable to it. He interviewed Della in Rosalind's parlor for the better part of 2 hours, and Martin waited on the porch steps with his hat in his hands. When the interview was over, the marshal came out and sat beside Martin on the steps. "Her account is clear and consistent," Harker said. "We have seen this kind of arrangement before. Brant and Greer are not the first men to try to move a woman through a freight system as though she were a piece of property." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. "The territorial law is on her side. What Brant did is kidnapping. What Greer was party to is conspiracy. I have warrants in my pocket that I drafted in Wichita before I rode here." Martin looked at him. "You drafted them before you even heard her full account." "I drafted them on the basis of Cobble's letter," Harker said, "because I have read enough of these letters to know that when a reputable sheriff writes me this particular kind of letter, the account he is describing is true." He paused. "I am riding for Ellsworth in the morning. I will take Dunbar as well." "He is the one who bound her wrists," Martin said. "I know." Harker looked out at the street. "Sullivan. Whatever you lose from riding out of that freight job, whatever Brant's blacklist costs you in Kansas, I want you to know that the federal marshal's office does not forget men who do the right thing at personal cost. I have a need for scouts in this territory who are honest and who can read country and who can be relied upon." Martin took that in. "I am listening," he said. "Come see me in Wichita when this settles," Harker said. "We will talk about it properly." He did not make any further promises, and Martin did not ask for them. A man like Harker's word was enough to take seriously. 3 days after Harker left for Ellsworth, word came back by telegraph that Cyrus Brant had been arrested. Cole Dunbar had been apprehended trying to leave Kansas by rail. Harlan Greer had also been taken, which had apparently required some significant effort as Greer had barricaded himself in his house in Grover's Crossing for the better part of a morning before his own ranch hands had persuaded him to come out. The warrants were solid. The territorial prosecutor was interested. The cases were going forward. Martin brought this news to Della, who was in Rosalind's kitchen helping prepare the evening meal. She was standing at the work table with flour on her hands, cutting dough, when he came in and told her. She stopped cutting and stood very still and looked at the work table. "It is over?" she asked. "Brant cannot touch you," Martin said. "Greer cannot touch you. Harker's office is involved now and they do not let go." She was very quiet. Her hands, still resting on the work table, had gone still in the flour. "Della," Martin said, and his voice was gentler than he intended. "It is over. You are free." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright with something that she was visibly and very deliberately not allowing to become tears. And he recognized that effort because it was the same effort he had seen in her face in the back of that wagon on the first night. The effort of someone who has held themselves together for so long that releasing the grip even slightly is frightening. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her. "You held up through all of it," he said quietly. "You do not have to hold up through this." She took a breath. Then she let it out slowly, and her eyes did not spill over, but something in her face softened in a way that was almost like coming home. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had said it simply, without qualifying it or hedging it. "Just thank you. You would have found a way out of that wagon eventually," he said. "I just got there first." She made a sound that was half laugh and half something more complicated. "You tore up a paper," she said. "You climbed into a wagon in the dark and untied a woman you had never met, and then you rode 60 miles with her to put her somewhere safe. And then you talked to a sheriff and waited on porch steps while a marshal interviewed her, and you did not ask for anything." "I am not built for asking," he said. "I know," she said. She looked at him steadily. "Martin, I need to say something to you." He waited. "I have spent the past 12 days in this town trying to decide whether what I feel when I am with you is real, or whether it is the feeling of someone who is very grateful to the first person who has been kind to them in a while." "That is a fair question," he said. "I have decided," she continued, "that it is both, that those two things can exist at the same time, and that the gratitude does not diminish the rest of it." She looked at him directly. "I am also aware that I have nothing to offer you by way of practical things. I have no money and no family and no established position anywhere. I have a willingness to work and a moderate talent for teaching and the ability to make reasonable coffee over a campfire." "The coffee was terrible," Martin said. "It was," she agreed, "but you drank it." "I drank every drop," he confirmed. She almost smiled. "Martin, I am not asking you anything. I want to make that clear. I would not ask you for something like this. But I want you to know what I have decided about you, which is that you are the kind of man I did not know existed in the arrangement I thought the world had taken on, and that being around you makes me feel like myself in a way that I have not felt for years. And I thought you should know that." Martin Sullivan, who was a man of few words and careful silences, looked at Della Keating standing in Rosalind Hatch's kitchen with flour on her hands and her chin lifted and her eyes absolutely steady, and he felt something in him that was much larger than a moment. "Della," he said, "I rode into this town because it was the closest safe place I could think of. I stayed in this town because I did not want to leave. I have been taking jobs helping a blacksmith and moving cattle when I have a standing offer from a federal marshal and money enough to ride to Wichita tomorrow, and the reason I have been staying is sitting right across from me with flour on her hands." She looked at him. I am 30 years away from being a romantic man, he said, and I am not going to tell you that I know exactly how this goes, but I know that I would like to find out, if you are willing. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread, and outside through the window the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the sky. I am willing, she said. He reached across the work table, and she extended her hand, and he took it, flour and all, and held it, and that was how it began. It began slowly, the way honest things begin, not with a single overwhelming moment but with many small ones laid carefully one against another. They began walking out together openly, which in Beaumont meant that everyone in town knew within approximately one afternoon. Rosalind Hatch expressed no surprise whatsoever. Sheriff Cobble shook Martin's hand the next time he saw him, which Cobble framed as being entirely about the warrant situation, but which both of them knew was about something else as well. Martin found himself gravitating toward decisions that were shaped by a particular question he had not previously asked himself, which was whether he was building something or just moving through. He had always moved through. It had served him well enough, and it had kept him from the kind of attachments that hurt when they broke. But moving through was a habit and not a need, and he discovered this in the same week he discovered that the corner room at Henley's farmhouse was becoming very familiar, and that familiar was beginning to feel like something he wanted to hold onto. He rode to Wichita in October, 2 weeks after Harker's initial offer, and spent 2 days discussing terms with the federal marshal's office. He came back with a position as a territorial scout and investigator, attached to Harker's office, which would require him to be in the field but gave him a fixed salary and a base of operations that could be anywhere within reason. He had negotiated that part specifically. He came back to Beaumont and told Della about it sitting on the front steps of the boarding house on a cool evening while the stars were coming out. "The base can be here," he said, "or anywhere I choose to make it. The work takes me out several weeks at a time, but I would come back." She was quiet, thinking about it. "Come back to what?" she asked carefully. He looked at her. "That is the part I want to talk to you about." She waited. "The town does not have a school teacher," he said. "Rosalind has been collecting that information, that the township has money set aside for a proper school position and a small schoolhouse that has been half built for 2 years waiting for someone to fill the role. The position is available to anyone the town's council approves." Della went very still. "You talked to Rosalind about a school position." "Rosalind talked to me about it," Martin said, "and then we talked together about it. Because she has been watching you work in her kitchen for a month, and she says you are too intelligent and too good with people to be cutting bread dough for the rest of your life, and I think she is right." "She is not wrong," Della said quietly. "The council would need to approve you," Martin said. "That means an interview and a demonstration of your qualifications. I think you would pass without any difficulty. You have a great deal of confidence in me." "I have met you," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment in the starlight. "Martin, you are describing a future. You are describing my future in this place." "I am describing a possibility," he said, "which you have every right to take or leave." "And where do you fit into this possible future?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care he gave to difficult things. "I would like to fit into it however you will have me," he said. "I am not a man who asks things on short acquaintance, but I do not think what I feel for you is short acquaintance. I think it started the moment you opened your eyes in the back of that wagon and told me I could save my breath." She laughed, and it was the warm, full laugh, and it broke through the careful stillness of the evening like light through a curtain. "You liked me then," she said. "I thought you were extraordinary," he said. She looked at her hands folded in her lap. Then she looked at him, and her expression was open in the way it only was in these quiet moments, without the controlled steadiness she kept around herself. "Ask me something specific, Martin Sullivan," she said. "I'm not going to interpret possibilities all night." He had thought about this. He was not an impulsive man, and he did not do things that he had not thought through. He had thought through this very carefully. "Will you marry me," he said, "and teach school here, and let me come back to you when I ride out and have somewhere that is worth coming back to." She was quiet for a long moment. The stars were fully out now. Somewhere in the direction of the creek, a night bird called once and then stopped. "Yes," Della Keating said. "Yes to all of it." He reached out and took her hand, and they sat on the boarding house steps in the dark for a long while, not needing to say anything more, because the important things had been said, and the rest was simply the good, quiet weight of the future taking its shape. They were married in Beaumont in November of 1873, 6 weeks after Martin's return from Wichita, on a Saturday morning with the air smelling of cold and wood smoke. The ceremony was held in the small church at the end of the main street, performed by the circuit minister, who came through on his regular rounds, and who had what Martin privately considered an excessive fondness for long scriptural passages, but whom he tolerated on the grounds that the occasion called for ceremony. Rosalind Hatch stood up for Della, and she wore a blue dress that she had clearly pressed with great care. Sheriff Cobble stood up for Martin, which surprised Martin slightly, though Cobble said only that someone had to do it, and he was the most qualified. The Henley family came, and the blacksmith and most of the town besides, because Beaumont was small and an occasion was an occasion. Della wore a dress that Rosalind and the wife of the general store owner had put together from available materials in the weeks preceding, cream-colored muslin with a fine brown ribbon at the collar and cuffs, and she had her hair pinned properly with good pins that Rosalind had contributed, and she stood at the front of that small church and looked at Martin with her clear brown eyes and said her vows in a steady voice that did not waver once. Martin said his in the plainest words the minister would allow him, which Cobble later said was the most Martin Sullivan thing he had ever witnessed, and Cobble had known Martin for 4 years. When the minister said they were married, Martin took Della's face in both his hands and kissed her with a gentleness that was also completely firm, the way he did most things, and the small congregation made a sound of warm approval. Rosalind Hatch wiped her eyes and denied doing so to anyone who asked. They made their home in Beaumont. Martin negotiated with the Henley family, and within 3 months had purchased the 2-acre parcel adjacent to the Henley property, where there was a solid small house that needed work. He spent his time between his first assignment for Harker's office in the spring of 1874 fixing and improving the house, which he approached with the same methodical competence he applied to everything. Della was busy at the school, which was now fully built and open with a class of 14 children ranging from 6 to 13. She loved it with everything she had. Martin would come home in the evenings, and she would be at the kitchen table in the house by the light of the oil lamp, planning lessons, working out arithmetic sequences on her slate, writing out the sentences she wanted to use for the older children's reading hour. She would look up when he came in, and her face would do the thing that it always did, that specific brightening, and he would hang his coat and sit down across from her, and they would talk about their days. His days involved a great deal of writing and an increasing amount of paperwork for Harker's office, which he managed by the light of many campfires during his weeks in the field. Her days involved 14 children who were at varying stages of learning and who presented her with every possible permutation of human behavior, from the boy named Ezra, who was 11 and already reading at a level that delighted her, to the 6-year-old girl named June who cried for the first 2 weeks of school and then became Della's most devoted attendee. Martin was gone, the first long stretch, for 6 weeks in March and April of 1874 on a survey assignment that took him deep into the Cherokee Outlet territory. He came back leaner and quieter than he had left, and he spent 3 days doing very little except being at home, helping with the fence line, eating Della's cooking, and sleeping in a proper bed. On the 4th day of his return, he was sitting on the porch watching the evening come in from the east, and Della came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee, the good kind made properly on the stove, and handed him one. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you too," he said. He said it simply because it was simply true, It had been the truest thing about those 6 weeks, truer than any survey reading or field note. The absence of her had been specific and constant in the way that a missing tooth is, noticeable not just when you thought about it but always in the background, a shape where something should be. She leaned her shoulder against his and they watched the evening settle over the plains. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think we are going to have a child," she said. He went very still beside her. He looked at her and she was looking out at the plains with a small, careful expression, the one she wore when she was saying something important and watching to see what it would do when it landed. "You think?" he asked. "I am fairly certain," she said. "I spoke to the doctor in town last week, Dr. Pemberton. He says by his estimation next autumn." Martin Sullivan was not, as established, a man given to large external expressions of feeling. But he set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and turned toward his wife and took her face in his hands in the same way he had at their wedding, and he looked at her for a long moment that contained a great many things that were beyond his current ability to articulate. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling very well," she said. "I am tired in the mornings, but that is manageable. You should not be taking on too much at the school," he said. "I am teaching school," she said. "I am not breaking rocks." "Della, Martin," she looked at him levelly. "I am going to keep teaching school for as long as I am able to. I worked very hard to have that school. I will not give it up because I am expecting. Women have managed considerably more difficult physical circumstances than a classroom for millennia." He looked at her. "You are right," he said. "I know you are right. But the concern is noted," she added, and she said it warmly. "And appreciated." He pulled her close and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat that way while the stars came out over Kansas. Their son was born in September of 1874, healthy and loud, at 7 pounds and some ounces, delivered in their house on the Henley Road by Dr. Pemberton, and attended by Rosalind Hatch, who was present entirely in her unofficial capacity as someone who was going to be present regardless of whether anyone had officially invited her. They named him James, for Martin's eldest brother who had died in the war, and Keating for Della's family name as his middle name, so that something of who she had been before was carried forward into who they were becoming together. James Sullivan was a large, good-tempered infant who slept in concentrated bursts and was awake with impressive focus for a newborn, observing the world from his cradle with the dark-eyed seriousness of his mother and the patience of his father. Martin held his son for the first time in the small hours of a September morning, while Della slept, finally, in the next room after the long labor of it. He sat by the window with the baby wrapped in the blanket Rosalind had made, and outside the Kansas night was immense and dark and sprinkled with stars. He looked down at James, who was awake and regarding him with unfocused but earnest attention, and he felt something so complete and clean that it had no words in any language he knew. Just the feeling itself, enormous and quiet, like the plains at first light. Della came back to school in the spring when James was 7 months old, bringing him with her for the first weeks, and then making arrangements with Rosalind, who had declined to admit openly that she had rearranged her boarding house schedule specifically so as to be available for child minding, but whose actions made the fact quite clear. The school grew. By 1875, there were 22 children, and the town council was discussing expanding the schoolhouse. Della went to that meeting herself and argued for a second room, and got it, and was also asked whether she would be willing to take on a student teacher who had applied from the normal school in Lawrence, a young woman named Frances who arrived in September and who turned out to be exactly what Della needed. Frances was energetic and willing and a little nervous in the way that new teachers are, and Della was patient with her in the particular way that Della was patient with people who were earnestly trying. Martin's work for Harker's office continued to go well. By mid-1875, he had enough of a reputation within the federal marshal system that he was being consulted on matters beyond simple scouting, including several investigations involving land fraud and water rights that were the growing concerns of the territory. He was good at the investigative work in the same way he was good at reading country, by paying close attention and not making assumptions. He was away less than he had been in the first year, partly because his assignments had become more regional and partly because Harker had recognized that a man with a wife and a small child and a house he is building will give a territory more over the long term than one with nothing anchoring him, and he had structured Martin's assignments accordingly. They were not without difficulty. Martin had 2 stretches of several weeks each when Della was alone with James, and the school and the house, and everything that a house requires, and they were hard. She wrote him letters by the oil lamp at night, practical letters mostly, about the roof that needed a new shingle on the west face, and the horse's shoe that needed seeing to, and Ezra at the school, who had been accepted to read for a lawyer in Wichita the following year. But between the practical parts of the letters, there were lines that she wrote with less caution, that she missed him in the mornings most of all, that James had said his first word which was not a word either of them had expected, and which she would tell him in person because it was better said than written. Martin wrote back in his own way, which was practical mixed with honest. He wrote her what he saw, the particular color of the sky over the Cimarron at sunset, a herd of antelope moving across open ground in the early morning, the way certain hills in the territory looked exactly like parts of the Ohio country she had described to him, so that he wondered if she would recognize them. And he wrote her that he was coming home, and that coming home was the thing he held in his mind when the work was difficult. She told him when he returned what James's first word had been. It was Dutch, which was the name of Martin's roan horse, who had become James's consuming interest from the moment the boy was old enough to be carried to the stable. Martin laughed with his whole chest when she told him, the real laugh that he kept private, and James, who was by then 14 months old and mobile in the catastrophic way of toddlers, came around the corner of the kitchen and saw his father laughing and sat down on the floor and laughed too. No idea what was funny, just joining in because his father was happy. The cases against Brandt and Greer moved slowly through the territorial court, as territorial courts tended to do, but they moved. Harker kept Della informed through Martin, which was considerate and deliberate. By the spring of 1875, Cyrus Brandt had entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge in exchange for testimony against Greer and Dunbar. It was not the full measure of justice that would have satisfied anyone, but it was something. It was a record. It was a public acknowledgement that what had been done to Della Keating was a crime. Cole Dunbar received 2 years in the federal penitentiary. Harlan Greer received 4, and was additionally stripped of several land claims he had been holding through methods that the investigation uncovered were not strictly legal. Martin brought the final news home to Della on an evening in May, riding in before supper, and she was in the garden behind the house where she had started a kitchen garden that spring, on her knees pulling weeds with James sitting nearby in the dirt in the manner of someone who has been expressly forbidden to pull vegetables and is considering it anyway. Martin tied Dutch to the fence and came around the house and crouched beside her. "It is finished," he said. She looked at him with the dirt on her hands. "Greer, 4 years, Dunbar is already serving his. Brandt's testimony is on the court record." He looked at her steadily. "It is done, Della, all of it." She was quiet. James had looked up at the sound of his father's voice and crawled purposefully in his direction. Martin picked him up automatically and held him against his shoulder, while James investigated his collar with determined fingers. Della sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, at the neat rows of what would be beans and squash, and the herbs she had planted along the fence. She looked at the house behind her, the house that was theirs, with the second window Martin had put in the east wall so the morning light would come into the kitchen, and the porch boards he had repaired over the winter. She looked at Martin, who was holding their son and watching her with his quiet, careful attention. She felt the last of something put itself down, Not a burden exactly, more like a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it was there, until it was gone, and the lightness of the absence was remarkable. "Good," she said. And then she reached across and put her hand briefly on his knee, and he put his free hand over hers. And there in the kitchen garden in the May evening they were just themselves, unhaunted. The years in Beaumont put down roots the way trees do, gradually, and with increasing strength. By 1876, the schoolhouse had its second room, and Frances was teaching the younger children while Della handled the older ones. Martin had been offered a regional position with the marshal's office that was essentially desk-based, and that would have meant more pay and more hours in one place, and he had discussed it with Della at length. "Do you want it?" she had asked him directly. He had thought about it honestly. "The field work is where I am most useful," he said. "The desk work would pay better, but it would make me someone's administrator." "Then do not take the desk," she said. "We are managing well enough." "You are sure?" "Martin. We have a house and a school and a healthy son, and more than enough to live on. If you take that desk you will be miserable within 6 months, and that will make me miserable, which will make James miserable, and nobody needs that." He had declined the desk position, which Harker had accepted with equanimity and possibly some relief, as Martin was genuinely more valuable in the field. In the autumn of 1876, Della told him she was expecting again, in the same way she had told him the first time, sitting beside him on the porch in the evening. He reached for her hand immediately this time. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "And the school?" "The school has Frances," she said, "and Frances is capable. I will manage this better than last time because I know what to expect." Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1877, and they named her Clara Ruth, Ruth being Della's mother's name. Clara was smaller than James had been and very quiet for a newborn, looking at the world with a calm consideration that Rosalind Hatch said was exactly like her father. "She has his eyes," Rosalind said. "That steady look." "She has his patience," Della agreed. Martin held Clara in his arms in the same chair by the same window where he had held James, on a spring morning instead of an autumn one, with the Kansas light coming in differently, softer and more green. And he felt the same completeness, but also something new inside it, the particular feeling of a life that is full in a way you did not plan for, and that is better for being unplanned. James was 2.5 and regarded his sister with the elaborate caution of a small person being introduced to something he had not asked for. He spent the first week hovering at the edge of any room where Clara was, and then gradually, over the following weeks, moving closer. By the time Clara was a month old, James had appointed himself her monitor, informing adults of any changes in her condition with the seriousness of a small official. Della watched her children and her husband and her school and the town that had become hers, and she felt, in the quiet moments, an astonishment at the specific shape her life had taken. Not because it was extraordinary in the way that stories were sometimes told, not because it had the shine of something invented, but because it was hers, built from the particular materials of her choices and Martin's choices, and the strange, terrible night in the back of a wagon that had somehow, impossibly, been the road to all of it. She did not sentimentalize the bad parts. The ropes on her wrists were not something she looked back on with anything but anger. Brant and Greer and Dunbar, and the entire machinery of men who thought they could move women through the world like cargo, were not things she had forgiven. Forgiveness was not required by justice, and she had chosen justice over forgiveness, and she was entirely at peace with that choice. But she had also chosen to not let what had been done to her be the largest thing about her. She was a teacher, she was a wife, she was a mother. She was a woman who grew beans in a kitchen garden and wrote letters by oil lamp, and had opinions about the best way to teach long division to 8-year-olds, and who loved a man who tore up papers and said plainly what he meant. One evening in the autumn of 1877, when Clara was 7 months old and James was nearly 3, Martin came home from a short assignment and found the house lit and warm and smelling of supper, and found Della at the kitchen table, not planning lessons but simply sitting, reading a letter. He hung his coat and washed at the basin and came and sat across from her. "News?" he asked. "A letter from Frances," she said. "She is engaged to be married, to a farmer near Larne. She is asking whether I think she ought to leave the school." "What do you think?" Martin asked. "I think she ought to do whatever she wishes to do," Della said. "But I told her in my return letter that marriage and teaching are not mutually exclusive propositions. I am evidence of that." "Strong evidence," Martin agreed. She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them. "I am thinking about asking the town council whether they would consider a third teacher position. The school is large enough to warrant it, and there is a young man in Wichita who trained at the normal school and who has been writing to inquire." "A young man teaching in Beaumont," Martin said. "There is no reason a man cannot teach school," Della said calmly. "No, there is not," Martin agreed immediately. She smiled at him. "You agreed very quickly. I have learned that arguing with your educational positions is a waste of perfectly good time," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. It was a gesture she made easily now, without the careful deliberateness of the early days, just naturally, the way a hand finds something it is accustomed to. "Are you tired?" she asked. "The ride was long." "I am fine," he said. "You always say that, and I am always fine." "Stubborn man," she said without heat. "Stubborn woman," he returned with warmth. She laughed. It was the real laugh, the warm, unheld one that he still collected quietly, the way he always had. James appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, his dark hair standing in 17 directions, regarding his parents with the solemn certainty of a 3-year-old who has decided he is not actually sleepy. "Papa," James said by way of announcement. "James," Martin said, "you are supposed to be in bed." "I heard you come home," James said. Martin looked at Della. Della looked at Martin. There was a conversation in this exchange that involved no words at all, the specific fluent communication of two people who have been married long enough to think at least partially in the same grammar. Martin pushed back from the table and walked to the doorway and picked up his son, and held him over his head until James shrieked with delight, and then brought him down and carried him back toward his room. Della listened to the sounds of Martin putting James back to bed, James's running commentary, Martin's quieter voice, the specific rhythm of a bedtime story begun, and she sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and felt the solidity of everything around her. She was Della Keating Sullivan, schoolteacher of Beaumont, Kansas, wife of Martin Sullivan, mother of James and Clara, tended resident of a whitewashed town on the Kansas plain, former cargo on a Wagon manifest, and the last of those things was the least of all the others and would eventually be only a distant story she might someday tell her children when they were old enough to understand what the world had looked like before it got somewhat better. She thought about the night in the wagon. She thought about the canvas lifting and the campfire light outside and the shadow of a man climbing up who turned out to be a man who helped. She thought about 50 miles on horseback across the Kansas plain in September, about campfires and terrible coffee and conversations that had found their way down to the real things faster than most conversations managed in a lifetime. She thought about the moment in Rosalind's kitchen with flour on her hands when Martin Sullivan had taken her hand across a work table. She was grateful for all of it, not because suffering was a path to something good, which she did not believe, but because the good things were entirely and completely good. And she was grateful for Beaumont and for Rosalind and for Sheriff Cobble and for Marshal Harker and for her school and her garden and her children. And she was grateful, most specifically, for the man currently in the next room telling their 3-year-old a story about a horse named Dutch who went on adventures, which was a story that would probably have considerable embellishments. She got up and put the kettle on for tea. Martin came back to the kitchen a few minutes later. "Is he asleep?" she asked. "He will be shortly," Martin said. "I told him Dutch once traveled all the way to California and back and met a bear." "A bear," she said. "A friendly one," Martin said. "It was a very wholesome story." She handed him a cup of tea. He accepted it and sat down across from her again, and they were quiet together in the lamplight the way they often were, in the good quiet that belongs to people who know each other well and do not need to fill every silence. "Martin," she said after a while. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you lifted that canvas." He looked at her. His face did the thing it did in the quieter moments, the thing she had come to know well and love specifically, the way the stillness of him became something warmer without changing in any external way, just a quality of attention that was also tenderness. "I am very glad I was paying attention," he said. "To the manifest. To everything," he said. She smiled at her cup. He reached across the table and touched her hand lightly, the backs of his fingers against her knuckles, and she turned her hand over and they held on in the quiet. In the years that followed, Beaumont grew steadily the way good small towns sometimes do, not explosively but with the solid, organic growth of a place that has something real to offer. The railroad's branch line came through in 1879, which changed things in the practical ways that railroads change things, bringing more goods and more people, and making the gap between Beaumont and larger centers feel smaller. Martin was at the station with James and Clara the day the first train came through, standing on the new platform with most of the town, while the locomotive came in with its extraordinary noise and smoke. James, who was 5, was rigid with excitement. Clara, who was almost 3, pressed her face against her father's shoulder, and then, when the noise settled to something manageable, turned and watched the train with the calm assessment of a person deciding whether to be impressed. Della stood beside Martin and felt the wind the train brought with it, and watched her children's faces, and thought that this was what the future sounded like, and that it was louder than expected but not unmanageable. Della's school became the best regarded in the county by the time Clara was old enough to attend it, which placed Della in the slightly complicated position of teaching her own daughter, which she handled by being entirely consistent in her expectations and entirely unwilling to show favoritism even when it was clearly warranted because Clara was extremely bright. Martin noticed this one evening when he was looking over Clara's primer at the kitchen table. "She reads above her level," he said. "All my children read above their level," Della said. "I run a proper school." "She also reads above James's level," Martin said. "James is gifted in other directions," Della said diplomatically. Martin looked across the table at James, who was at that moment attempting to balance a wooden spoon on his nose with extraordinary concentration. "You do not have to be diplomatic," Martin said. "He is persistent," Della said firmly. "Persistence is an undervalued quality." In 1880, their third child came into the world, a boy they named Thomas after no one in particular, just because the name suited him. Thomas was the liveliest of the 3 by some margin, arriving already in a hurry and maintaining that quality thereafter. He was crawling at 6 months and walking at 10, and talking in full sentences by the time he was 18 months, much of which he used to narrate events as they were happening in a running commentary that was simultaneously exhausting and excellent. Martin came home from an assignment in the summer of 1880 to find Thomas, who was not yet 2, carefully explaining to the family's barn cat the correct method for catching a mouse. The cat was listening with what appeared to be genuine interest. "He talks a great deal," Martin observed to Della. "He has his father's attention to detail and his mother's need to communicate it," she said. "It is an interesting combination." "That is the most charitable framing of that I have ever heard," Martin said. She looked at him sideways with the particular look she had, which was fond and slightly wicked in the best possible way. "I have had years to perfect the framing," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him in the way she had long since stopped being careful about, simply and naturally, and they watched their youngest child explain mouse hunting to a barn cat in a voice of perfect seriousness. The barn cat caught a mouse the following morning. Thomas took full credit. Rosalind Hatch, who had been the first shelter and the first certainty in Beaumont, passed away in the winter of 1881 at an age she had never exactly disclosed but which Dr. Pemberton estimated at somewhere north of 70. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, in her own bed, having declined the night before to be moved to a more convenient location, with the explanation that she had not moved rooms for anyone in 30 years, and saw no reason to begin now. Della sat by her bedside through the last afternoon and evening. Rosalind was not sentimental about it. She spoke clearly and directly, the way she always had, and what she said to Della in those last hours was private, but Della carried it with her afterward like something valuable, worn clothes. The town of Beaumont mourned Rosalind Hatch with the sincerity it reserved for people who had mattered. Martin gave a short eulogy that was mostly accurate, and that Rosalind would have found acceptable, meaning it did not exaggerate. Della placed a small bunch of wildflowers she had dried from her garden on the grave. The boarding house went to a woman named Gertrude, Rosalind's niece, who came up from Wichita, and who ran it with great competence if somewhat less personality. The town adjusted. Life adjusted, as lives do, not by forgetting what it had been but by incorporating the new shape of what was. By 1882, Della had been teaching in Beaumont for 9 years. She had taught nearly every child in the township under the age of 14, and a number who were older. She had seen children go on to positions in law and commerce and medicine and teaching, and she felt about each of them a specific and private pride that was not possessive, just the pleasure of a gardener watching things grow. Martin had built a reputation in the federal marshal's office that went beyond Kansas, and he was occasionally consulted by offices as far as the Colorado Territory and down into Indian Territory. He handled these consultations with the same quiet professionalism he brought to everything. He was not famous. He had no interest in fame. He was simply very good at his work, and he did it. He came home after every assignment to a house that was lit and warm, to children who were growing in their different directions, to a wife who was her own complete person, and who was glad to see him in a way that was genuine and specific, and which he never took for granted. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in November of 1883, Martin saddled Dutch's successor, a younger roan also named Dutch in the manner of a man who finds a good name and sticks with it, and rode out to the south edge of town, while Della was putting the children to bed. He came back with a bunch of late-season wildflowers, which was the best available option on the Kansas plain in November, and found Della sitting in the parlor by the fire with a book. She looked up at the flowers and then at him. "They are somewhat the worse for the season," he acknowledged. "They are perfect," she said. She put the book down and stood and took the flowers, and then she put her hand against his face, her palm against his jaw, and he turned his head slightly into it and closed his eyes. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he confirmed. "You tore up a Wagon manifest," she said, "and here we are." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "Here we are," he agreed. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. She asked it lightly, but there was genuine sincerity underneath it, the sincerity of a woman who knows that sincerity is better than performance. "None," Martin said. He said it the way he said everything that he meant completely, without elaboration, because elaboration was not necessary. She kissed him, standing there in their parlor with the fire behind her and the flowers between them. And it was the kiss of two people who have been married 10 years and know each other in the way that 10 years of honest living together creates, which is better than any other kind of knowing. From the next room, James, who was 9 and had inherited his father's inability to fully sleep until he knew everyone was accounted for, called out, "Mama." Della pulled back and looked at Martin with her eyes bright. "You had better go tell him we are not on fire," Martin said. "He knows we are not on fire," Della said. "He is checking." "He is checking," Martin agreed, "because he is exactly like you." She looked at him. "You say that like it is an inconvenience." "I say it like it is a fact," he said. "A fact I'm entirely fond of." She smiled at him once more and then went to reassure James, and Martin stood in the parlor with the late-season wildflowers and listened to her voice in the next room, low and warm, and the sound of James settling, and somewhere further back the small nighttime sounds of Clara and Thomas in their room. He stood in the parlor of his house in Beaumont, Kansas, and felt it again, the thing he had no perfect words for, the completeness, the wanting to be here in the morning, the having found the place worth finding. Outside the window the Kansas night was enormous and old and indifferent, the way it had been on the night he had read a manifest by a dying campfire and something in him had cracked open. The stars were the same stars. The plains were the same plains. But everything else was entirely different, because he had climbed into a wagon in the dark and untied a woman's wrists and torn a paper into pieces, and she had looked at him with her clear brown eyes and said he could save his breath. And from that single ordinary act of choosing the right thing the whole of this life had come. James and Clara and Thomas, and this house, and this fire and Della's voice in the next room, and everything that was yet to come. He put the flowers in the jar of water that Della had left on the side table, which told him she had expected him to come home with something, and he sat down in the chair by the fire and waited for his wife to come back to the room. She came back 2 minutes later and sat beside him and leaned her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. "James is asleep," she said. "Good," he said. They sat in the firelight in their home on the Kansas plain, and the night stretched out enormous and quiet around them, and they were in it together, which was all of it, which was everything.